They had been warned that black American soldiers were creatures without mercy, terrifying beings who would torment them, violate them, and abandon them to die in roadside pits. But when 247 Japanese women stepped onto the dock from the transport ship in San Francisco Bay on September 12, 1945, the enemy did not try to crush them with brutality. Instead, the black American soldiers disarmed them with something far more unsettling: simple kindness and unexpected treats like chocolate and warm smiles that seemed impossible to understand. These women had prepared themselves for execution. Instead, they were met with hot running water, beds made with fresh sheets, and black American soldiers who politely held doors open for them. By the third day, quiet murmurs began to travel through the rows of bunks. "We have never encountered men who behave like this." What followed would unravel everything they thought they knew about opponents, about duty, and about their own identities. If accounts like this capture your curiosity, make sure to subscribe. These real memories from World War II reveal the humanity hidden beneath the suffering of battle. The September fog lay thick over San Francisco Bay, coloring everything in shades of gray and cold. The transport vessel eased through the water at a slow pace, its engines groaning like a weary animal. On deck, 247 Japanese women gathered in tight groups, their fingers gripping the railings and their eyes wide with fear. Most were young adults between 18 and 30 years old. They had worked as nurses, radio staff, interpreters, and office assistants for the Imperial Japanese Army throughout the Pacific. Now they stood in worn uniforms, their hair tangled and filthy, their faces gaunt from weeks of limited food on the voyage. Some held onto small cloth bags with all their belongings inside. Others carried nothing at all. The sharp scent of salt water blended with the smell of diesel. Above them, seagulls cried out, circling the ship like patient scavengers. Through the heavy fog, the Golden Gate Bridge slowly appeared, its tall red towers rising like something unreal. The women stared in stunned silence. None had ever witnessed anything like it before. In their homeland, most bridges had been bombed into ruins. Here was a structure so tall it seemed to touch the clouds, flawless, untouched, unbelievable. "They will end our lives when we reach the shore," whispered Ko, a 22-year-old nurse from Osaka. Her words shook as she spoke to the woman standing closest to her. Yuki, who had served as a radio operator in the Philippines, did not respond. She simply watched the coastline draw nearer, her jaw tight with dread. She knew what happened to captives. She had heard the warnings. Their propaganda officers had repeated over and over that Americans were barbarians. They insisted Americans would hurt Japanese women in unspeakable ways. They said Americans would strip them of dignity and humanity, and that death would be kinder than what awaited them. The ship's horn sounded 3 long, sorrowful notes. The women recoiled at the echo. Some started to weep quietly. Others whispered old family prayers, begging their ancestors to give them strength. A few remained completely rigid, unable to move or think, stunned by terror. As the ship settled beside the military pier, black American soldiers became visible on the dock. Dozens of them stood in relaxed lines, smoking cigarettes and chatting with one another. The women pressed themselves against the ship's railing, staring down at the men they had been conditioned to fear. But something felt strange. The black American soldiers were not scowling, they were not shouting insults. Their weapons were not raised toward the prisoners, they were simply standing and waiting, and some were even laughing at casual jokes. One black soldier lifted his hand in a small wave toward the deck, a gesture that looked almost friendly. Ko grabbed Yuki's arm tightly. "Did you see that? He waved at us." "Maybe it is a trap," Yuki murmured back, meant to make us relax, before she could not finish the thought. Neither woman wanted to picture what might follow before. The gangway dropped with a loud metallic clatter. Several white American officers appeared at the top of the ramp, holding clipboards and calling out instructions in English the women did not understand. Then a Japanese American soldier stepped forward to translate their words. "You will leave the ship in a single line. You will receive identification, medical evaluations, and living quarters. You will not be harmed. You are prisoners of war protected by the Geneva Convention." The women exchanged bewildered glances. Geneva Convention, what was that supposed to mean? Ko had no idea. Yuki had heard of it only faintly, never in detail. They began to step down the ramp slowly and unwillingly. To them, every step felt like approaching their final moments. The boards creaked beneath their feet as the fog curled around them. And below, the black American soldiers continued to wait, their faces showing no anger, no menace, only a kind of curious and gentle interest. Ko's foot touched the American pier for the very first time. She braced herself for dread. Instead, she felt only utter bewilderment because the first black soldier she walked past gave her a smile. Not a cruel smile, not a mocking one, simply a warm smile. And somehow that small gesture felt more frightening than any weapon. The women were guided into a wide white building that smelled of strong disinfectant mixed with a floral scent they could not name. Inside, white American women in nursing uniforms stood waiting, their clothing perfectly pressed and their expressions steady and calm. This was their first shock. Women. The Americans had sent women to handle their intake. Please remove your uniforms and place them inside these bags. The translator said, you will receive clean garments after your examination and shower. A wave of alarm rushed through the group. To remove their uniforms in front of unfamiliar people was a terrible humiliation. Ko felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. In Japan, modesty was sacred. Being seen without clothing by strangers was considered a disgrace worse than dying, but there was no alternative. Slowly and with great reluctance, they began to undress. Some women turned their backs, desperate to hide themselves. Others moved quickly as if speed might lessen the shame. The white American nurses walked among them with gentle and steady movements, offering no ridicule, no harshness. They handed each prisoner a white towel and pointed toward the next room. The medical inspection was efficient but careful. The nurses looked for injuries, infections, and signs of illness. They wrote brief notes on their clipboards, spoke to one another in quiet English, and sometimes offered a small, comforting smile to the terrified women. One nurse noticed how Ko's hands trembled and gently placed her palm on Ko's shoulder. It is all right, the nurse said softly in English, though Ko could not understand the words. But she understood the tone and she recognized the compassion in the woman's eyes. Ko began to sob. Then they were taken to the showers. They entered a large tiled room with many shower heads arranged along the walls. Warm steam filled the space like a comforting blanket. The translator explained that they should wash thoroughly, that soap would be supplied, and that they could take their time. Soap, real soap. The women stood completely still. They stared at the white bars of soap resting on small shelves beneath each shower head. They lifted the bars slowly, as if touching something rare and delicate. The soap felt smooth and weighty in their hands, and carried a scent like blooming flowers, like lilacs in early spring, like a world untouched by destruction. Yuki turned the water handle and gasped when hot water cascaded over her. Hot water, not lukewarm, not chilly, but truly hot. She had not felt real heat from water in more than a full year. In the field hospitals where she had served, they were fortunate to have any water at all. Around her, other women cried as they bathed. Some let out broken laughter mixed with tears, their voices high and shaky. Others simply stood motionless beneath the streams, letting the water pour over their faces, over their hair, and over their bodies, washing away months of dirt and dread and exhaustion. Ko scrubbed her skin so hard it turned pink. She washed her hair 3 full times, working her fingers through knots she thought would never come out. The soap foamed into thick white bubbles, and the floral scent wrapped around her like something out of a dream. She remembered her mother's garden in Osaka and the way the cherry blossoms had smelled in April before the war arrived. When they finally stepped out, they were given clean undergarments, simple gray dresses, and soft cotton socks. The dresses were plain but spotless, and they fit well enough. Some women looked at themselves in the wall mirrors, barely recognizing the reflection staring back at them. Clean. They actually looked clean. An older woman named Tomoko touched her cheek as if she was seeing her own face for the first time. I forgot, she whispered. I forgot I could look this way. But beneath the relief, underneath the sudden comfort, a heavier feeling stirred. Confusion and shame began to creep in. They were meant to be suffering. They were supposed to be brutalized. Instead, they had been given soap, warm showers, and fresh clothing. What kind of enemy behaves like this toward captives? They were guided into a mess hall large enough to seat 300 people. Long wooden tables filled the room, each covered with a spotless white cloth. The scent of food reached them before they even stepped inside. Fresh bread baking, meat roasting, coffee steaming, butter melting. The aroma was so rich and overpowering that several women froze in the doorway, unable to move. Please take a seat, the translator said. Lunch will be served. The women shuffled toward the tables and sat down with rigid posture and hands folded tightly in their laps. They glanced at one another with wide, frightened eyes. This could not possibly be real. It had to be a deception of some kind. Maybe the food was poisoned. Maybe this was their final meal before torment began. Black American soldiers dressed in white kitchen clothing approached with large trays. They walked down each row and placed plates in front of every woman. Ko stared at her plate and felt her breath catch. Roast chicken, golden and glistening, mashed potatoes with a pool of warm brown gravy, green beans, a thick slice of soft white bread topped with a square of yellow butter. Beside the plate was a glass of cold milk and a cup of steaming coffee. She had not seen this much food in one place for 3 full years. Around her the other women sat completely still, gazing at their meals. No one lifted a fork. No one touched the food. They stared at the plates as though everything might disappear if they blinked. "Please eat," the translator urged gently. "It is meant for you." Still, none of them moved. At last, Yuki picked up her fork. Her hand trembled as she cut a tiny piece of chicken and lifted it to her lips. She chewed slowly, closing her eyes. The flavor burst across her tongue. Rich, savory, unmistakably real. She swallowed and tears slipped down her cheeks. Her reaction broke the silence. Women all around her began to eat, some cautiously and others with frantic urgency, terrified the food would be taken away. Tears rolled down faces as they chewed. Some women laughed between bites, the sound edged with desperation and joy at the same time. Others ate quietly, staring at their plates, unable to comprehend what was happening. Ko bit into the bread and gasped at how soft it felt. For the last year of the war, she had eaten bread mixed with sawdust and ground tree bark. This bread was soft and white and perfect. She spread butter on it with shaking hands and took another bite. The richness made her light-headed. Across from her, Tomoko cried so hard she could not bring herself to eat. She held a piece of chicken and stared at it as her entire body trembled. "My children," she whispered. "My children are starving in Tokyo and I am eating chicken." The guilt swept over all of them at once. While they sat here eating roast chicken and mashed potatoes, their families back home searched through rubble for scraps. Their children were drinking thin grass soup. Their parents were dying of hunger in destroyed cities, and here they were. The enemy was feeding them better than their own nation ever had. Some women pushed their plates away, unable to continue. Others finished everything on their dishes, driven by a hunger so powerful it drowned out shame. A few ate and cried at the same time, their tears falling onto their potatoes as their bodies warred between relief and agony. The black American soldiers watched quietly from the edges of the hall. Some looked uneasy, shifting from one foot to the other. One young soldier whispered to a companion, "They are crying. Should we do something?" "Just let them eat," the older soldier answered softly. "They will be all right." But would they truly be all right? Ko could not say. She no longer knew what to believe. The enemy was meant to be merciless. The enemy was supposed to despise them. But this was something entirely different, and that was the most unsettling thing of all. After the meal, the women were guided back to their barracks. They walked in a daze, their stomachs full for the first time in months, their minds reeling from everything they had experienced. The barracks were simple wooden buildings painted white with small windows and neat rows of beds inside. Beds, not blankets on a floor, not piles of straw. Actual beds with metal frames, mattresses, pillows, and neatly folded blankets. Each bed had a small wooden trunk at the foot. The translator explained that they could keep their few belongings in the trunks and that they were allowed to write letters to their families, and that paper and pencils would be provided. Letters home, they could contact their families. Ko chose a bed near a window and lowered herself onto the mattress. It felt soft, not extravagant, but soft. She pressed her hand down and felt it sink gently, then rise again. She had not slept on a mattress since leaving Japan 2 years earlier. Beside her, Yuki traced the wool blanket with her fingers, her expression far away. "It is thick," she murmured. "It is winter in California and they gave us thick blankets." Other women walked through the barracks, opening trunks, testing mattresses, whispering to each other in voices full of disbelief. At the far end of the room, a small wood burning stove waited cold and unused. The translator explained that it would be lit each evening to keep the barracks warm. Tomoko lowered herself onto her bed and covered her face with her hands. "This feels wrong," she murmured. "Everything about this feels wrong. We are prisoners. We are supposed to endure hardship. We are supposed to pay for what our nation has done." But instead, she lifted her eyes and looked around the barracks at the beds and blankets and curtained windows. "Instead, they treat us as if we are still human beings." That night, as darkness settled and the lights dimmed, the women lay in their beds wrapped in warm blankets, listening to the strange noises of an American military base. Trucks rumbled in the distance, black American soldiers called to one another in English, and the deep hum of generators filled the air. Outside, crickets chirped and somewhere a radio played music that was soft and jazzy and completely unfamiliar. Ko pulled the blanket up to her chin and stared upward at the ceiling. Her body felt warm. Her stomach was full. She was clean, she was safe. And she had never felt more bewildered in her life. She remembered the propaganda films she had watched in Japan, the ones that showed Americans as soulless monsters with no honor and no pity. She remembered the officers who had insisted that surrender meant torment and a slow death. She thought about everything she believed she understood about the enemy. And then she thought of the black soldier who had smiled at her on the dock. She thought of the nurse whose gentle hand had rested on her shoulder. She thought of the food she had been served and the soap she had held. Everything she had ever been taught was collapsing, and that realization frightened her more deeply than any battlefield she had ever known. The days settled into a pattern that felt unbelievable in its simplicity. Every morning at 6:30 a bell rang across the camp, soft and clear. The women rose from their beds, put on their plain gray dresses, and made their beds with strict precision, a routine they could not abandon even in captivity. Breakfast was served at 7 o'clock in the mess hall. Oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins, scrambled eggs, toast with sweet jam, fresh fruit like apples and oranges, and sometimes even bananas, along with coffee and milk. Every single morning this abundance appeared on their tables as if it had materialized out of thin air. After breakfast, the women received their work assignments, but these tasks were nothing like the brutal labor they had feared. Some were assigned to the camp laundry, where large mechanical washers did most of the work. Others prepared meals in the kitchens under the guidance of American cooks. A few who spoke some English helped translate documents or taught simple Japanese phrases to curious Black American soldiers who often approached them politely. Ko was placed in the camp hospital, assisting the nurses with basic duties like folding bandages, organizing supplies, and cleaning equipment. The tasks were light, almost gentle. She worked beside two American nurses named Helen and Margaret, who treated her not as an adversary or a captive, but as part of the team. They showed her how to use the medical tools, taught her the English names for various supplies, and sometimes even shared their lunches with her. The most astonishing part was that they earned wages. Every Friday, the women were given small amounts of camp script, a paper currency used only within the camp but valuable nonetheless. With this script, they could visit the camp canteen, a small store filled with items that felt unreal. Chocolate bars, Hershey, Nestle, Baby Ruth. The women stood before the candy shelves like children standing at a sacred altar, their eyes wide with wonder. In Japan, chocolate had vanished years earlier, kept only for the highest-ranking soldiers. Here, prisoners of war could buy it with the money they earned. The store also held cigarettes, lipstick, hand lotion, pencils, notebooks, tiny bottles of perfume, and handkerchiefs embroidered with flowers. These were not things required for survival. These were luxuries, small tokens that made life feel gentle again. Yuki bought a chocolate bar during her first visit to the canteen. She carried it back to the barracks with the care of someone holding a jewel, unwrapping it slowly and breaking off one small square at a time. The sweetness melted across her tongue and she closed her eyes to savor it. "I am eating chocolate," she whispered to Ko. "We are prisoners of war and I am eating chocolate." The schedule continued each day. Lunch arrived at noon, always hot and generous. Dinner came at 6 o'clock, often with meat included. Between meals there were breaks, short periods of rest, and even time for recreation. The Americans had created a small library in one of the buildings, filled with Japanese books they had somehow collected. The women were allowed to borrow books, read during free time, and discuss stories together. On Sundays no one worked. They could rest, write letters, or attend religious services if they chose. A Buddhist chaplain visited once each month, while Christian services were available every week. The Americans made room for both traditions. This schedule, this gentle and almost home-like routine, slowly chipped away at their inner defenses more effectively than cruelty ever could. Their bodies grew healthier. Color returned to their faces. They gained weight and the sharp bones beneath their skin softened. But with renewed strength came emotional turmoil, because every day of comfort came with rising guilt. Every meal reminded them that their families were starving. Every chocolate bar felt like a betrayal of those suffering in Japan, and yet they could not refuse it. They could not turn away the food or the warmth or the gestures of kindness. They were not trapped by fences or guards. They were trapped by the contradiction of an enemy who treated them better than their own government ever had. At night, the women gathered in small groups in the barracks, whispering to one another as they tried to make sense of everything. Some clung fiercely to their old beliefs, insisting this kindness was a trick, that the Americans were pretending only to gain information or obedience. Others had begun to doubt the stories they had been raised on. The war had ended. Japan had lost, and in defeat they had discovered something that shook them deeply. The enemy was not what they had been told. The enemy was far more complex, far more human, and in some ways far more frightening. Letters from home arrived at a slow and painful pace, sometimes taking weeks or even months to reach the camp. They came in thin envelopes. The paper was worn and delicate, and the handwriting looked strained and desperate. Each letter felt like a blade pressed directly into the heart. Ko's first letter from her mother arrived in late October. She sat on her bed in the fading evening light and opened it with shaking hands. The paper was so thin she could nearly see through it. Her mother's handwriting, once graceful and steady, now drifted unevenly across the page. "My dear Ko, we learned that you are alive and being held as a prisoner in America. This news brings me relief as well as sorrow. I am relieved that you survived, yet sorrowful for whatever hardships you must be facing. Tokyo has been destroyed. Our home is nothing but broken debris. Your father and I now live inside a shelter made of scrap metal. We are fortunate if we eat once each day. Today we had rice, water, and a few pieces of cabbage. Your younger brother grows thinner with every passing week. He asks about you constantly. He remembers how you used to bring him small treats before the war. There are no treats now, there is barely any food at all, but we remain alive, and that is something. I pray that you are being treated decently. I hope your suffering is not too great. We think of you every night in our prayers. Your loving mother. Ko read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling more with each reading. She then folded it with great care and placed it inside her trunk. That evening she was unable to eat her dinner. She stared at the roast beef and carrots on her plate and saw her younger brother's thin face instead. She pushed the plate aside and returned to the barracks. She was not the only one struggling. All around her, women were receiving letters just as painful. Messages filled with starvation, homelessness, and despair. One woman learned her husband had died from malnutrition. Another discovered her parents had been killed when their neighborhood burned. A third learned that her children had been sent to distant relatives because there was no food left in the cities. The contrast became overwhelming. Here in California, the camp was surrounded by abundance. Outside the fences, American towns thrived with busy streets and open shops. Children played in parks. Families drove cars along clean roads lined with homes that had never been touched by bombs. The women saw glimpses of this whenever they were taken outside the camp for work assignments. Life moved forward untouched, as if the war had taken place in another world entirely. Yuki worked in a field one day, picking vegetables beside other prisoners. At midday, the black American guard supervising them opened his metal lunchbox and shared his sandwiches with the women. He did it casually, as though it were nothing special. Ham and cheese on white bread wrapped in wax paper. He passed out sandwiches the way a man might toss crumbs to birds in a peaceful park. "My wife always makes extra," he explained through the translator. "She thinks you girls might be hungry." His wife, a woman none of them had met, had prepared sandwiches for enemy captives simply because she believed they might need food. Yuki accepted the sandwich with both hands, bowing deeply as tears ran down her face. That night she wrote in the journal she had started, "The guard's wife sent sandwiches. She does not know us. We were her country's enemies. Our nations fought and people died because of it. And yet she sent sandwiches. How am I supposed to hate people who behave like this? How can I remain loyal to an empire that let me starve while the enemy feeds me?" The physical changes became impossible to hide. The women looked healthier than they had in years. Their skin glowed softly, their hair shone with new life. They had regained weight and no longer appeared hollow. When they caught sight of their reflections in windows or mirrors, they often could not recognize themselves. Tomoko stood in front of a mirror in the washroom one morning, studying her own face. "I look like I did before the war," she whispered. "I look healthy, I look nourished." She touched her cheek, feeling the softness and the absence of sharp bone. Then she remembered her children's thin faces from the last photograph she had received, and she turned away, unable to look at herself any longer. The guilt felt suffocating. To be well fed while your family starved, to sleep in a warm bed while your parents shivered in metal shelters, to taste chocolate while your children searched for grass to boil in water. This was a form of torment far more refined than any beating. It was the torment of receiving mercy when you believed you deserved punishment, of being treated with dignity when you expected humiliation, of realizing that everything you had been taught about honor, sacrifice, and enemies might be untrue, and that untruth cut deeper than any blade. It was the small moments that unraveled them, the effortless kindnesses that defied logic, the brief interactions that cracked open the rigid walls built out of fear and hatred. Ko was carrying a stack of folded linens to the hospital one afternoon when she stumbled over an uneven board. The linens flew from her arms, scattering across the hallway floor. She dropped to her knees at once, desperately gathering them, her face burning with embarrassment. In Japan, such clumsiness would have earned her a harsh reprimand, perhaps something worse. But instead of anger, she heard laughter, not cruel laughter, but light and friendly laughter. She looked up to see an American doctor, a young man named Captain Miller, smiling as he knelt to help her. "Happens to everyone," he said in English, though she did not understand the words. But his tone told her everything. He was not upset, he was not irritated, he simply wanted to help. Together they picked up the scattered sheets. When they finished, he handed the stack to her and gave her a playful salute, still smiling. Then he walked away, whistling a tune she had never heard before. Ko remained kneeling in the hallway for a long moment, holding the linens, trying to understand what had just taken place. An American officer, had knelt to help her, an enemy prisoner, gather laundry from the floor, and had smiled at her. Who exactly were these people? Another day, Yuki was walking back from the fields when she heard music playing. She followed the sound to an open window of an American barracks building. Inside, a group of young black American soldiers stood around a record player, laughing and looking at a photograph. One soldier saw her standing outside and motioned for her to come closer. "You like music?" he asked through gestures, since neither of them spoke the other's language. Yuki nodded shyly. The soldier stepped inside and returned moments later holding the record. He offered it to her. "Gift," he said, using one of the few Japanese words he knew, "puricento." She stared down at the record in her hands, Glenn Miller and his orchestra. She tried to return it, shaking her head, but the soldier refused. "No, no, you keep it for the girls in your barracks." That night the women gathered around as Yuki placed the record on the small phonograph provided for their recreation. The music drifted through the barracks, bright and bold and unmistakably American. Some women frowned and turned away, unable to enjoy music from the enemy, but others closed their eyes and let the rhythm wash over them. Music was music, no matter where it came from. The moment that struck them the deepest came in November when the first cold wave reached California. The women woke to frost covering the windows and their breath forming white clouds in the air. They stayed wrapped in their blankets, bracing themselves for the kind of cold that sinks into the bones. But at breakfast, the American commander made an announcement through the translator. "We have ordered more blankets and warm coats for all prisoners. They should arrive sometime next week. Until then, we have increased the coal supply for your stoves. Please stay warm." That was all he said. No dramatic display, no hint that they owed thanks, just a simple acknowledgement that the cold had arrived and that steps were being taken to protect them. Tomoko sat at the breakfast table with tears streaming down her cheeks. "They notice when we are cold," she whispered to the women beside her. "The enemy notices when we are cold and brings us blankets." She remembered the winter her family endured in Hiroshima 2 years before the bomb, when they burned furniture because the military had taken all the coal. She remembered her children's blue lips and shaking bodies. She remembered how her own government had looked at its civilians and seen only resources to be used and thrown away. And now here was the enemy providing blankets simply because prisoners might be cold. The clash in her mind was overwhelming. And it was in these small moments, the doctor helping with dropped linens, the black American soldier giving away a record, the commander ordering blankets, that their entire worldview began to collapse. Because how do you despise someone who treats you with humanity? How do you cling to loyalty when the people you were taught to hate show more care than your own leaders ever showed you? These questions tormented them, and none of them had answers. By December, the emotional struggle tearing through each woman had become more brutal than any battle they had ever witnessed. Ko lay awake most nights staring up at the dark ceiling of the barracks, her thoughts spinning in endless circles. During the day, she worked in the hospital helping the American nurses with their duties. She had learned enough English to understand simple instructions. She could even hold short conversations. Nurse Helen had started teaching her medical terms, repeating each word patiently until Ko pronounced it correctly. The day before, Helen had squeezed Ko's shoulder and said, "You are a natural at this. You should become a nurse after the war." After the war. As if a future existed for her, as if there was something waiting beyond these fences, beyond this strange in-between life of being a prisoner who was treated like a guest. At night, Ko would take out her mother's letters and read them under her blanket by flashlight. The words never changed, but they cut deeper every time. Hunger, cold, desperation. Her younger brother growing weaker. Her father coughing blood because he had given his food ration to the children. And here she was gaining weight, learning English, being praised by an American nurse. The guilt felt like a heavy stone in her chest. It made breathing difficult. Every bite she took felt like a betrayal. Every warm night under her blanket felt like wrongdoing. She was living better here than she ever had in Japan, better than most civilians had lived even before the war. And she was doing so inside the enemy's custody. What did that make her? A survivor, a traitor, both, neither. Yuki's internal struggle was different but equally painful. She had been fiercely loyal to Japan, a true believer in the emperor and the idea of a greater East Asia. She had volunteered for service. She had trusted every piece of propaganda. She had been willing to die for her country, but now every belief she held was breaking. She had been told Americans were racist and would treat Japanese people as less than human. Yet every day she watched black American soldiers interact with them with a relaxed politeness that did not fit the narrative she had believed. She had been told American culture was shallow and corrupt, yet she found herself humming the jazz songs she heard on the radio. She had been told surrender meant disgrace worse than death. Yet here she was, alive, freshly bathed, well-fed, and her shame came not from surrender but from how comfortable she had become. One evening she sat in the barracks with her journal open, trying to write, but no words came. How could she explain this to herself, much less to anyone else? Finally she wrote, "I have become the enemy, not because I am held by Americans, but because I have begun to see them as human. And in seeing them as human, I have betrayed everything I was taught. But if what I was taught was untrue, then what was I loyal to? What did I sacrifice for? And if the sacrifice meant nothing, then what am I?" The question stayed on the page, unanswered and impossible to answer. All around them the other women faced their own private battles. Some coped by clinging tightly to their old beliefs, avoiding speaking with the Americans and eating their meals in rigid silence. They took the food and the warmth but refused any friendliness. These women sat apart, their faces hardened, their eyes distant. They would accept survival, but nothing beyond that. Others embraced the new reality with eagerness that bordered on desperation. They learned English enthusiastically. They laughed at the soldiers' jokes. They listened to American music without shame. They seemed to shed their Japanese identity like a worn coat, covering themselves in American acceptance as if that could shield them from the losses they carried. But most of the women lived somewhere between those extremes, torn and exhausted. They could not fully cling to the past, but they could not fully accept the present either. They stood in a psychological no-man's land, too changed to go back, but too Japanese to step completely forward. The Americans, meanwhile, seemed unaware of this inner struggle. They saw only prisoners who appeared healthy, cooperative, even cheerful. They did not see the late-night tears, the journals filled with guilt, the whispered questions about loyalty and betrayal. Or maybe they did notice and simply did not know how to respond. Because how do you offer comfort to someone whose suffering comes from kindness instead of cruelty? The discussions began quietly in hushed tones after lights out, but as the weeks went on, the conversations grew louder, more emotional, more urgent. The women knew they had to make sense of what was happening to them, and the only way to do that was to talk it out together, even if those talks turned into arguments. "We are still Japanese," Fumiko insisted, a former translator who had once worked in the Philippines. She was one of the strict traditionalists who refused to learn any English. She would not allow herself to smile at the Americans. She ate each meal with her back turned toward the guards. "Nothing they do can change who we are," she said. "They give us food because the Geneva Convention tells them they must, not because they feel anything for us. This is all a show for politics," Fumiko said firmly. "When we return to Japan, everyone will judge us based on how well we protected our dignity while we were prisoners." "What dignity?" Yuki demanded. Her voice was sharp and bitter. "We were sent into war by men who promised us honor and victory. They gave us nothing. They gave us hunger and defeat. And now the enemy feeds us, clothes us, and treats us like human beings, and we are expected to feel ashamed of accepting it." "I will not feel ashamed anymore," she said. "You are being used," Fumiko snapped back. "This is exactly what they want. They want us to forget who we are, to feel grateful to them, to become their helpers." "Helpers in what?" Ko asked quietly. She sat on her bunk with her knees drawn tightly against her chest. "The war is over. Japan lost. What are we really helping them do just by accepting food and a bed?" "We are helping them create a story about our humiliation," Fumiko replied. "A story in which America is the kind victor and we are the thankful losers. A story that says they are better people than we are." "Maybe they are better," Sachiko said in a soft voice. She was only 19 years old and had worked as a clerk in a medical unit. "Or maybe not better, but different. I was taught that Americans had no honor and no respect for human life. But here I have seen more respect than I ever saw in the Imperial Army. I watched officers strike soldiers for the smallest mistakes. I watched commanders send men to certain death and call it glory. Here I see black American soldiers joking with one another, treating their officers like human beings, obeying orders without treating their leaders like gods. That is not weakness. That is something different. It is democracy," Tomoko said quietly. She was the oldest woman in the barracks, in her late 30s, and when she spoke, everyone listened. "I read about democracy before the war in books that were later banned. It is the idea that ordinary people can question those in power, that leaders are meant to serve the people instead of the people serving the leaders. I thought it was only a fantasy, but watching these Americans, I think perhaps it is real." "Democracy did not stop them from dropping atomic bombs on our cities," Fumiko said in an icy tone. "Democracy did not stop them from burning Tokyo and killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. You should not romanticize them just because they are kind to us now." A heavy silence settled over the barracks because Fumiko was right and all of them knew it. The same nation that handed out blankets and chocolate had also unleashed destruction beyond imagination. How could both of those things be true at the same time? How could one people be capable of such warmth and such cruelty? Maybe, Yuki said slowly, that is what makes them strong. They can destroy completely and then still show mercy afterward. That is not weakness, that is strength, a frightening kind of strength. The discussions went on night after night, never reaching a clear conclusion. New lines of division appeared among them. Older women who remembered Japan before militarism took over were more ready to doubt what they had been told. Younger women who had grown up listening only to propaganda struggled to let go of their beliefs. Some women pulled away from the debates altogether, choosing silence rather than facing questions they could not answer. Others became almost obsessed with the arguments, talking for hours as if the right words could somehow make it all make sense. But underneath all the loud voices, underneath all the mental struggle, there was one simple truth that each woman felt but rarely spoke aloud. They had been deceived about the enemy, about the war, about loyalty, about honor. Those lies had taken everything from them: their homes, their families, their sense of who they were. Now they had to piece together a new understanding of the world from the fragments that remained. It was exhausting, it was painful, and it was necessary because they could not move ahead without facing the truth, and they could not return to the people they had been before. They were trapped in the middle of a change, and the only way out was to keep moving through it. The true turning point arrived in late December when the camp arranged a Christmas celebration. The women watched with quiet fascination as the Americans decorated a tall tree in the recreation hall with lights, ornaments, and a shining star at the top. They had never seen anything like it in their lives. The commander announced through the translator that the prisoners were invited to attend the Christmas gathering. There would be special food, live music, and gifts. Gifts for prisoners of war. Most of the women went simply to satisfy their curiosity. They sat in straight rows of chairs watching Black American soldiers perform songs and short comic skits. Some of the jokes did not carry over across language, but the effort was clearly sincere. The Americans were genuinely trying to give their prisoners a sense of happiness. Then the gifts were handed out. Each woman received a small package wrapped in paper. Ko opened hers with shaking hands and found a bar of soap, a comb, a tiny mirror, and a chocolate bar. They were ordinary things, useful things, yet they had been wrapped in bright paper and tied with a ribbon as if they were precious. She stared down at the bundle in her lap and felt something inside her quietly open. It did not split in pain, it opened like a seed cracking so that something new could begin to grow. These were not grand gifts. They were not bribes meant to buy their loyalty. They were simple human gestures, one person offering another a small kindness because it was Christmas. In that moment, Ko finally understood. The Americans were not treating them well because of some clever political plan. They were not obeying the Geneva Convention only out of fear or pressure. They were behaving this way because this was how they believed people should be treated, even enemies, even prisoners, even Japanese women they had fought only weeks before. This was the hard truth. American power came not only from guns and bombs, but from the belief that every person had value, from the belief that even an enemy should be granted basic dignity, from the belief that you could win a war without relying on cruelty. This was the idea they had been taught to fear and resist, the idea that individual lives mattered more than the demands of the state, the idea that human rights existed regardless of birthplace or allegiance. And it was working. It was already reshaping them. Every plate of food, every warm blanket, every small act of kindness carried this idea. You may defeat us with your armies, these actions seem to say, but we will rebuild you with our mercy. We will show you a different way to live. Yuki sat next to Ko, clutching her own wrapped gift, tears sliding down her face. It is not a weapon, she whispered. It is simply who they are. That is what makes it so powerful, all around them. Other women were crying too, not with simple sadness, but with something more tangled. Tears of release, perhaps, tears of understanding. Tears for the beliefs they had once held and the sacrifices they had made in the name of those beliefs. Tomoko rose from her chair, walked slowly to the front of the room and bowed deeply before the American commander. The entire hall fell completely silent. Through the translator, she said, "Thank you for treating us as human beings. We did not expect this. We were taught to expect cruelty, and instead you have shown us something different, something we do not fully understand yet, but we are grateful." The commander shifted awkwardly at their gratitude, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as his face turned slightly red. "We are only following the rules, madam," he replied. "The Geneva Convention says we must treat prisoners of war properly. We are not doing anything special." But they were doing something special. They truly were. Because choosing to honor rules that protect even your enemies, choosing to treat prisoners with respect even when your own people have died, choosing mercy when revenge is within reach, that means everything. That is the entire point. As the celebration went on, something subtle changed across the barracks. The number of hardliners grew smaller. The fierce arguments began to fade. A shared weariness settled over the women. It was the tiredness that comes when resistance finally collapses. They could no longer maintain their hatred in the face of such steady, gentle humanity. They could not keep believing propaganda that called Americans monsters when those supposed monsters were giving them Christmas presents. They could not remain loyal to an empire that had abandoned them while the enemy was the only reason they were still alive. Their transformation was not finished. It would take many years, perhaps decades, for some of them to fully sort through what had happened. But in that moment, in that decorated hall with the glowing Christmas tree, the wrapped gifts and black American soldiers singing carols, something fundamental inside them shifted. They started to see their captors not as faceless enemies but as people. Flawed people, yes, people capable of terrible violence, yes, but people all the same, and by seeing this they began questioning everything else they had been taught. The most powerful weapon America possessed was not the atomic bomb. It was the simple and radical belief that every human being deserved dignity, no matter their nationality, and that belief was working exactly as intended. The moment of self-recognition arrived in January 1946 on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Ko was in the hospital storeroom organizing medical supplies when she caught her reflection in the glass door of a cabinet. She froze, staring. She did not recognize herself at first. The woman in the reflection had round cheeks, smooth skin, bright eyes, and healthy hair that glowed even in the dim light. She looked young again, alive again. The hollow, haunted expression she had carried through the last 2 years of war was completely gone. She looked like she had before the war. No, she looked even better than she had before the war. Because even during peaceful years in Japan, she had never eaten this well, never received this level of medical care, never been this healthy. The enemy had done this. The enemy had restored her to herself. Ko's hands began to shake. She grabbed the edge of the cabinet for balance, her breath breaking into sharp, uneven gasps. Because in that moment, staring at her own healthy face, the full weight of betrayal collapsed onto her. Not betrayal by the Americans, betrayal by her own country. Japan had taken her youth, her energy, her innocence, and burned them as fuel for its war machine. Japan had fed her propaganda instead of food, ideology instead of medicine, duty instead of compassion. Japan had demanded her sacrifice and given nothing back. Japan had taught her that suffering was noble, that hunger was honorable, that dying for the emperor was the highest purpose. All of it lies, every bit of it lies. Because here she was, a prisoner of war, healthier and happier than she had ever been as a free citizen of the empire. Here she was, fed and clothed and treated with humanity by the very people she had been told to hate and fear. The Americans had not broken her through cruelty. They had broken her through truth. The truth that she was worthy of food, worthy of care, worthy of being treated as a human being. And that truth shattered everything she thought she understood about loyalty and honor and sacrifice. She slid down the wall onto the floor, leaning against the cabinet as sobs tore their way out of her. Not soft, quiet tears, but deep, raw cries pulled from a place of profound hurt. She cried for the girl she had been, the girl who had believed every lie. She cried for the years she had spent serving a cause that never cared for her. She cried for her family still suffering in Japan, still trapped inside the lie. She cried for all the people who had died believing their sacrifices meant something, when they had only been fuel for leaders who did not value them. Nurse Helen found her 10 minutes later. The American woman took one look at Ko's face and understood instantly, without the need for words. She sat on the floor beside her, not touching her, not trying to fix anything, just sitting with her in her grief. "It is all right," Helen said softly, even though Ko barely understood English. "It is all right to feel angry. It is all right to feel betrayed. You were lied to. You have every right to mourn that." Ko looked at her through blurred vision. This woman, this American who had every reason to resent her, whose nation had fought hers, who had likely lost someone she loved in the war, was sitting quietly beside an enemy prisoner who was falling apart. And in that moment, Ko's worldview did not simply crack, it shattered completely. She understood now. This was what democracy looked like. This was what it meant to believe that every person had worth, no matter which flag they had fought under. This was the philosophy Japan had tried to crush, the belief that human rights did not come from emperors and were not earned through suffering but existed because human beings existed. Japan had lost the war, but more than that, Japan's entire belief system had been exposed as hollow. Because when you placed the two systems side by side, one that treated people as tools of the state and one that treated people as individuals with value, the difference was undeniable. She thought of her younger brother starving in Tokyo. She thought of the black American soldier who had shared his lunch with her the day before. She thought of the emperor living untouched in his palace while the people suffered. She thought of the American commander ordering extra blankets so that prisoners would not freeze. The comparison was overwhelming and painfully clear. That evening, Ko stood in the barracks and addressed the gathered women. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I saw myself in a mirror today," she said. "I looked healthy, and I realized that I look better now as a prisoner than I ever did as a free citizen of Japan. And that is not because America is perfect. It is because Japan failed us. It failed us completely and without mercy." She looked around the room at faces filled with both agreement and conflict. "I am not saying we should abandon who we are," she continued. "I am not saying we should become American, but I am saying we must face the truth. We were lied to about the war, about the enemy, about what our country was fighting for. And unless we face that truth, we cannot move forward." A stillness drifted across the barracks. Then slowly, one by one, women began to nod. Some wiped away tears, some stared at their hands, but most nodded, because they had all looked in mirrors. They had all felt the unsettling truth of being healthier in captivity than they had been in freedom. They had all struggled with the same painful realization. The enemy had treated them like human beings, and in doing so had revealed that their own country never had. That was the moment everything shifted, not slowly but all at once, like a dam breaking. The resistance, the denial, the desperate attempts to cling to old beliefs, all of it collapsed beneath the flood of painful but liberating truth. They were still Japanese. They would always be Japanese. But they would never again be the women who believed every piece of propaganda. They would never again be the women who trusted blindly. They would never again believe that suffering for the state was noble. They had changed, and there was no path back to who they had been. As winter faded into spring, rumors of repatriation drifted through the camp. Ships were being prepared, plans were being finalized. Soon the women would be sent back to Japan. This news should have filled them with joy. They were returning to their families, their culture, their homeland. This was what they had prayed for, was it not? But instead of joy, the women felt fear. Ko lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, her stomach tight with dread. What would be waiting for her when she returned? Her mother's letters described only ruin. Tokyo was in ashes, food was scarce, disease was everywhere. The Japan she remembered, the Japan of cherry blossoms, festivals, and peaceful streets, was gone, replaced by hunger and devastation. And she would return to that world healthy, filled out with color in her cheeks. How could she explain that to her starving family? How could she meet her younger brother's hollow eyes and tell him she had eaten roast chicken while he searched fields for weeds? "I am afraid," Yuki confessed one evening as they sat on their beds. "I am afraid to go home. What kind of person does that make me? Japan is my home, my family is there. But the thought of leaving this place," she let the words die off. "Do you feel guilty?" Ko asked softly, finishing the thought for her. "Do you feel guilty because this camp, this prison, has treated us better than our own country ever did? And because admitting that makes us sound like traitors?" "But it is the truth," Sachiko whispered. "I have tried not to say it, but it is true. I do not want to return to starvation. I do not want to return to a nation that sees women only as tools. I do not want to return to a life where my worth exists only in how much I serve the state." The conversations continued in hushed tones, always tinged with shame, because what they were admitting felt impossible. They preferred captivity in America to freedom in Japan, not because they loved America or rejected who they were, but because food, shelter, and dignity mattered more than the hollow ideas of loyalty and sacrifice. Some women even asked the American officers if they could remain in the United States, if there was any way to stay rather than return. The answer was always the same: no. The Geneva Convention required that they be sent home. They could not stay, but the fact that they even asked showed how deeply everything had changed. These women, once taught that death was better than dishonor, were now pleading to remain with the very people they had been taught to despise. The propaganda had warned that the Americans would break them, and in a way that warning had been correct. But the breaking had not come through cruelty. It had come through something far stronger, the steady, undeniable demonstration that there was a different and better way to live. The ships left in April 1946. The women stood on deck watching San Francisco Bay fade into the distance. The Golden Gate Bridge shrank on the horizon. Many women cried. Some waved to the black American guards on the pier who had come to see them off. The journey across the Pacific lasted 3 weeks. The conditions were not as comfortable as the camp. The ships were crowded and the waves rough, but they were given food regularly and treated with basic respect. Nothing like the terrifying transport ships of the war years. When the coastline of Japan finally appeared ahead of them, the women crowded toward the railings, straining to see their homeland. What they saw made their hearts sink. Destruction, complete and overwhelming destruction. Cities burned to ash, harbors filled with sunken and broken ships, shorelines torn apart by bombings. As they sailed past Hiroshima, the full extent of the atomic devastation appeared. A whole city gone, flattened, wiped away. They docked at Yokohama and the reality struck them with full force. Skeletons of buildings, streets lined with rubble, people dressed in rags searching through debris, children with swollen bellies and empty eyes begging for food, women selling whatever they had, clothing, heirlooms, even themselves, just to survive. This was what they returned to. This was home. Ko stepped off the ship onto Japanese soil and felt no happiness, only a heavy sorrow. Around her, other women cried, not with joy but with grief at what their nation had become. They passed through a repatriation center, received a few basic supplies, and were released to find their families. Ko boarded a train toward Tokyo, watching the ruined landscape pass by the windows. Burned forests, fallen bridges, ghost-like towns where lively cities had once stood. She found her family living in a temporary shelter in what had once been a thriving neighborhood. Her mother looked 20 years older. Her father was ill with tuberculosis. Her younger brother, now 12, was so thin she could barely recognize him. When they saw her standing there healthy and full-faced, their first expressions were happiness, but the happiness quickly shifted to confusion, then to something else, something that felt like accusation. "You look healthy," her mother said carefully. "The Americans treated you well." Ko nodded, unable to speak as tears streamed down her cheeks, because she understood what her mother did not say. "You were eating while we starved, you were warm while we froze, you were safe with the enemy while we lost everything." And the guilt she had felt at the camp was nothing compared to the guilt she felt now. Years passed. Japan slowly rebuilt itself, rising from ashes into a thriving economic nation. The occupation eventually ended. Democracy took hold, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. The women who had once been prisoners in America scattered across Japan, rebuilding their lives and rarely speaking about what they had experienced. But they were changed, deeply and permanently changed. Ko became a nurse, inspired by the time she spent working in the American hospital ward under Black American medical staff. She never married, choosing instead to devote her life to caring for others. In the 1960s, she opened a small clinic in Tokyo. She treated her patients with a philosophy she had learned during captivity, that every person, no matter their status or background, deserved dignity and compassion. She kept the American nursing textbooks that Nurse Helen had given her as a farewell gift. Sometimes, during quiet afternoons, she would flip through the pages and remember the woman who had sat beside her on the hospital floor while she cried. Yuki married a Black American soldier during the occupation and eventually moved to California. Her family was scandalized, but she did not care. She had learned that love and kindness mattered far more than national pride. She raised 3 children who grew up speaking 2 languages and living between 2 cultures, equally familiar with chopsticks and forks. She taught them that identity did not have to be narrow or pure, it could be broad and blended. Tomoko returned to her children and spent the rest of her life trying to teach them what she had learned, that propaganda was dangerous, that questioning authority was necessary, and that a person's worth did not come from serving the state but from their inherent humanity. Most of the women never spoke publicly about their time as prisoners. The shame was too deep, the contradictions were too painful. But privately, in quiet talks with their daughters and granddaughters, they passed on the lessons they had learned. They taught the next generation to question, to think, to recognize propaganda when they heard it. They taught them that the enemy is not always who you are told it is, and sometimes the people who show you the most humanity are the ones you least expect. And so the soap, the chocolate, the clean sheets, all of it became more than objects. They became symbols of the most powerful weapon America used, the simple belief that every human life had worth. Even the lives of enemies, even the lives of those who once fought against you. For those Japanese women, the taste of chocolate and the scent of soap proved that everything they had been taught was false, that the enemy could show mercy, that dignity was stronger than cruelty, that sometimes the heaviest burden to carry is not hatred, but kindness from the very people you were taught to despise. In her later years, Ko told her niece about her time in the American camp. The young woman, born long after the war, listened with wide eyes. "So the Americans were good to you?" she asked. Ko shook her head slowly. "It is not that simple. They dropped atomic bombs on our cities. They killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. They were capable of terrible destruction." She paused, looking out the window at modern Tokyo, shining with glass and steel and wealth. "But they were also capable of mercy, of treating their enemies with dignity. And that mercy changed me more deeply than any punishment could have. It made me question everything. Painful truths, but truths all the same." She gave a sad smile. "I spent my entire life trying to share what I learned, that your enemy might treat you better than your own leaders, that propaganda is always a lie, no matter who tells it, that human dignity is greater than borders and nationalism. These lessons destroyed everything I once believed, but they gave me something far more valuable, the ability to see clearly. That is the story worth remembering." These were the women who discovered that the real battlefield was not between nations but between ideas. One idea viewed people as tools, the other saw them as individuals deserving protection even when they were enemies. If this story touched you, please subscribe to this channel and tap the notification bell. History is filled with uncomfortable truths like this. Stories that challenge what we believe about enemies and allies, about war and peace, and about who the real monsters are. These stories matter. They remind us that humanity can survive even in the darkest hours and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simple kindness. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Leave a comment telling us your thoughts. And remember, the past has lessons for us if we are brave enough to listen.